I'm Johnny Dormy, and today I will perform Japanese Coded Communications in World War II, the key to understanding the Pacific Theater. Before the Pearl Harbor disaster, the Army and Navy failed to anticipate the Japanese attacks, exposing weaknesses in American signal intelligence. Amazingly, just 6 months later, Commander Joseph Rochert successfully translated Japanese coded communications, revealing Midway as the next target. Admiral Nimitz used this intelligence to defeat the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. These communications were the key to understanding Japanese plans and allowed Nimitz to turn the tide in the Pacific War. Hello, I'm retired Rear Admiral Edwin T. Layton. I just got back from the 10th commemoration of the Pearl Harbor attack. I dug out this old newspaper and read it. What a horrible day it was. We did not know that much about the Japanese. We did not understand their coded communications at all. Amazingly, just 6 months later, we had the intelligence. We communicated this intelligence effectively to the people who could use it, and in turn they understood its importance and acted upon it. Let's look at two major failures of communication at Pearl Harbor. Hello, I'm Robert Thacker. I was a pilot in the Kangaroo Squadron throughout World War II. My story starts on December 1st, 1941, when my squadron received orders to take our B-17 heavy bombers to the Philippines. The United States had already cut off all trade and frozen Japanese assets. Now we were moving bombers to their doorstep. We took off on the first leg of our journey on the night of December 6th from San Francisco. We arrived at our first stop, Pearl Harbor, on the morning of December 7th. As it happened, we got there at about 8 a.m., right in the middle of the first attack wave. As we were approaching Pearl Harbor, we could see smoke billowing above the island. One of my crew said they must be burning off sugarcane. But what about the waterspouts offshore? Whales? Then the tower told us that Pearl Harbor was under attack. And, you're second to land. Oh boy, oh boy. The smoke was from the battleship Arizona, which, like 4 other battleships, was sunk. And the waterspouts? Those were from falling anti-aircraft shells. All of our bombers had our defensive armaments removed to save weight. So we were completely defensive if we were attacked. Several of our bombers were attacked by Japanese fighters and were unable to fight back. Thankfully, we all landed safely, though 2 of the bombers never flew again. Later we learned that the Army knew that the Japanese were coming and didn't tell anyone. 2 Army enlisted men, George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Lockhart, were finishing up the night shift at the Army Mobile Radar Station on Okinawa Point. A huge blip showed up on their screen at about 6 a.m. Elliott told their superior, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, about the sighting. The lieutenant did not take it seriously and said that it was probably us, the B-17s, coming from San Francisco. He was wrong. It was the Japanese attack force. They had the information, but they failed to communicate. Joseph Lockhart made this great radar plot showing where the Japanese planes were, but at the time, nobody understood what it meant. Later, when the Navy was looking for the Japanese so that they could retaliate, the Army didn't tell the Navy this either. Army-Navy communications had completely broken down. As a Navy man myself, I have to agree with Lieutenant Thacker. Not only did the Army fail to communicate with themselves, they also failed to communicate with us. I'm Admiral Husband E. Kimmel. I was the commander of the Pacific Fleet before the Pearl Harbor disaster. I lost my job. Every day when he was at Pearl, Commander Rochert emerged from his basement dungeon to greet me and deliver an intelligence packet. This packet was of the Japanese coded communications received in the previous 24 hours. However, Rochert's analysts could only decode about 10% of any given communication, so most of our information came from radio direction finding. However, the Japanese carrier attack group was under radio silence, so there was no way Rochert could have told me that the Japanese were coming. However, messages in the Japanese diplomatic codes pointed directly to war. Rochefort's superiors in Washington were supposed to be decoding these messages. They even had a purple machine which did all the decoding for them. If Washington had been doing their jobs and communicating effectively with those of us at Pearl, we could have saved over 2,000 lives on December 7, 1941. The largest problem Rochefort's analysts faced was the lack of messages in the codes they were trying to break. However, the April 18, 1942 Doolittle raid created a flood of traffic, which allowed analysts to decode 20 to 30% more of any given communication. This then allowed analysts to decode the critical messages that foretold the Midway invasion. These communications were the key to understanding Japanese plans and led to the American success at the Battle of Midway. Let's join Admiral Nimitz on the 5th anniversary of the Midway attack. In May of 1942, Rochefort decoded parts of several messages recalling ships to assemble at the island of Truk in the South Pacific. This tipped us off that there was about to be another major attack. The question was, where were they going to attack? Washington thought that the Japanese might attack anywhere from Samoa in the south to Johnson Island or Hawaii farther north. However, in some of the messages, the target was specified as AF. AF was one of hundreds of geographic designators used by Japan during the war. The first letter of its designator determined what country it had been occupied by before the war. The Americans knew this by March of 1942 and knew that designator starting with A determined that it was an American island. However, by April of 1942, Rochefort and his Washington superiors agreed that AF represented Midway Island. However, later in April, Washington changed their mind and thought that the Japanese had changed their system and that they were trying to trick us. Then Rochefort remembered that all of Midway's water came from a desalination plant. With my approval, Rochefort and Layton sent a message on May 19th via undersea cable to Midway. The radio operators there were to send an unencoded message reporting that the desalination plant was broken. 2 days later, Tokyo Naval Intelligence sent a message reporting that the AF Air Unit had sent a message reporting that they were low on fresh water and requesting immediate resupply. Washington was still not convinced. However, the Japanese invasion fleet included 2 transport ships full of fresh water. Thankfully, I understood Rochefort's communication and sent our carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet to intercept the Japanese fleet near Midway. As it was, our carriers were in the perfect position to ambush the Japanese carriers. We sank 4 of their best carriers and downed 300 of their best pilots. This broke a streak of 6 months of Japanese victories and turned the tide in the Pacific War. This eventually culminated in the defeat of the Japanese air and naval forces, leaving the Japanese mainland virtually unprotected. In 1985, Joseph Rochefort was posthumously awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal by President Ronald Reagan, finally receiving the recognition he deserved. Before the Pearl Harbor disaster, the Army and Navy failed to anticipate the Japanese attacks, exposing weaknesses in American signal intelligence. Amazingly, just 6 months later, Commander Joseph Rochefort successfully translated Japanese coded communications, revealing Midway as the next target. Admiral Nimitz was then able to defeat the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. These communications were the key to understanding Japanese plans and allowed Nimitz to turn the tide in the Pacific War. Thank you.